We've come to perhaps the better known part of the story of the night Jesus is betrayed. We're in Mark chapter 14 and verse 32. And again, we hope you join us for Palm Sunday when we talk about the Passover and how it connects here. And then on Easter, we're going to do a very special service both days. But on Easter itself, the bulk of our time together will be a narrative, a seamless narrative from first to the last about all of this, as if we're just telling the story as from all four Gospels and from other sources, and put together seamlessly in one story. I think you're really going to enjoy how that works, and so please make sure you're with us for that. Here we are in Mark chapter 14, verse 32. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. It is important for us to know that we will never understand how much Jesus was human and how much he was God, how much he knew about one, how much he knew about the other. We know he's 100% human, 100% God. Don't get me wrong, but it's about how the emotions affected him, even with the knowledge that he had. And here it's very plain to see he went through everything we would go through if we knew we were about to go through what he is going to go through. There's no lessening. I can remember when I was a teenager, I had friends that weren't church people, and they would say, well, you know, he knew he was going to rise again, so and he being God, it probably didn't hurt him as much, and he emotionally he was. I'm going, have a look at the words. It looks to me like he was 100% human in the way he reacted to what was coming up. He knew what was coming up. In fact, take a look at the first thing he says after it says he was deeply distressed and troubled. He says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Now, not sorrow about upcoming death, but he was so upset, sorrowful, depressed, anxious, fearful, that it felt like he was about to die right then. And I look at that and I go, that's 100% human. That's what humans do. He said to them, "Stay here, keep watch." See, he knows the mob's coming. He knows there's a limited amount of time he's got until this all ends, and it ends rather harshly for him. Rather harshly. That's a very British understatement, isn't it? It ends horrifically for him. They don't really get that yet. He's been trying to tell them. So he says, you know, he picked his favorites, Peter, James, and John, and you're allowed to have favorite people. He says, watch, because our time's limited. I got to pray. You keep watch. Well, he goes forward a little further in verse 35. He falls to the ground. He does not gently get down and kneel like you see in the paintings with a bit of light on him and his untear-stained face turned toward the heavens. He falls. He prays that if possible the hour might pass from him. Abba, which is Aramaic, the language of his childhood, for Papa, Daddy, Father. He said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. I love the way this is put out in John, but we're not going to do that until we get to the book of John in our Just Jesus stories. But I want to stop here for a moment and take a very close look at this. The word cup, don't misunderstand what's going on here. Technically, Jesus is not asking that he not die. He is asking that the suffering be taken. They use the word cup to mean a lot of things. Like Jesus even asked him, "Are you ready to drink the cup I'm ready to drink?" In other words, you willing to go through what I'm about to go through? And of course, the apostles said yes because they didn't know any better. He even goes further. He says, "Are you ready to be baptized with what I'm going to be baptized with?" You know, overwhelmed, immersed. And they said yes, not getting it. But cup back then often referred to a cup of sorrow. Now, it could also refer to joy. You always look at the context. Wine was given in the Old Testament as a sign of joy repeatedly. But then the cup of sorrow, the cup of misery, the cup of pain, that was a very, very common illustration, metaphor. So he's not technically asking that he not die. He's asking that it doesn't hurt. Think of that. Here's the Son of God asking his Father, please don't let it hurt like I know it's going to hurt. I can't help but think of the time, I think my son was around 6 years old, 6 or 7, and he did what 6 and 7-year-olds do. They all do. He went off his bike, hitting the handlebars on the way down, cut his chin. It seems like every kid does this. It's part of growing up. My wife called me. I was at my office, and she said, I think he needs stitches. I heard him yell, no, I don't. And, can I bring him and let you? And so, came down. He had a dish rag on his chin. Pulled away, and I said, that needs stitches. And he was, no. So we went to the ER and laid down, and here came the PA in, and he said, all right, we're going to numb it up first, and we're going to put some stitches in. And he says, and Duncan looked at him and said, is this going to hurt? And he goes, no, not at all. Duncan immediately turned to me, and he goes, is it going to hurt? And I said, yes. PA turned to me with wrath on his face. I didn't care. I looked at my son, and I said, it's going to hurt a bit. But he is going to numb it, so you won't feel the worst bit. But the first part you're going to feel. And I can't take that away from you. I said, what I can do, you want me to hold my hand over your eyes? Well, he does it. And he nodded. I put my hand over his eyes, held his hand. He took it, not a whimper. Because he'd been told he was ready. But here I keep thinking, Jesus is looking up saying to God, can you just not let it hurt? But even then, and John, again, fleshes this out beautifully. I think had he stopped there, I truly believe God would have sent in the 10,000 angels, ended the whole program. You and I and all humanity would have been lost. Probably annihilated, obliterated, a bad idea, gone. Because God's not going to turn down his son. But then Jesus says something pretty amazing. He goes, however, it's not about what I want. It's about what you want. And I believe the entire universe dropped its held breath. I believe the entire universe went, he's going through with it. He's going to do it. He didn't call for the angels. I think they were ready. I know they were ready. But he says, nevertheless. Wow. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Remember just a few verses ago? Die for you, with you. Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. How many times have we quoted that one? Because it's he looks, he knows, all right, I know you want to, but I know you're tired. But there's going to be hard times coming for you. You're going to be sorely tempted this night. Watch, pray that you be ready for this. Once more he went away, prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. Even a writer here is saying they slept because they were tired. It wasn't because they didn't care about Jesus. They were tired. They did not know what to say to him. I love the humanity in this story. I wouldn't have known what to say to him either. Returning the third time, he said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour is come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let's go. Here comes my betrayer. There was no, let's run, let's hide. There was none of the, call my lawyer. No, going to take it. Let's go. Jesus did that for us. And we need to remember how bravely he did this. And just how powerful he must have been to hold to the path when he could have pulled the cord at any time and said, no, I'm done, God, stop it. And he didn't. He kept facing forward. As he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. I got to tell you this, apropos of nothing. When I was a boy, this whole concept, he's going to kiss him? That just seemed wrong. So our ministers told us that the word kiss technically meant touch. It kind of does. So Jesus just go up and tag him. There's not going to be a man kiss here. But they're wrong. The Jewish customs of the day was to greet with a kiss. Many places in the world, it still is. I'm glad I don't live in one of those. If I lived in France, I think I would be constantly going, But maybe it's because too British or something. But, I might get used to it, but there's no way I'm returning it. It's one of those. So Judas just goes up and kisses, because that's what you did as a friend. And the betrayer had done this. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. Now notice again, why would you need a signal to show who Jesus was? Because he wasn't a white guy with blonde hair that shined, wearing a white robe, holding a sheep. He looked as rough as a bunch of unemployed fishermen, tax collectors, and ruffians. Because the zealots were really ruffians, and zealots were among the apostles. He didn't look out of place. He was just a big peasant that didn't look any prettier than them, didn't look any special. So he had to be pointed out. The men seized Jesus. Now, here's where we lose a part of the story. In the other Gospels, we find out that when Jesus walked down and said, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus, the son from Nazareth." And he goes, "That's me." That they fell down trying to get away from him because they weren't expecting him. They were expecting the white guy, the blonde hair, and the sheep guy, I guess. Somebody weak, somebody not able to fight, somebody not able to clear the temple, and the temple guard not even touch him. Somebody that the people had tried to say, "Let's kill him." And the Bible says he turned and walked through the middle of them. Love that story. This is not who they expected. And then he walked out to them again after they'd fallen down and tried to get themselves back up and said, "Who are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus." He said, "That's me." That's when Judas did the signal and they arrested him. So Peter leaves that out, and Mark is the writer of Peter. So I don't know why, but now you know. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword. Who is it that drew the sword and cut off the high priest's ear? Everybody knows it's Peter. How do we know that? Because of Matthew and Luke. Mark, John Mark is writing down the sermon illustrations of Peter, says somebody did that. Who knows? Could have been me. Could have been. It was dark. It was very confusing. So it's just one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And if you're a kid right now, when I was a kid, I had the same question. Why did he cut his ear? He wasn't aiming for the ear. He was just swinging, and it got the ear. You see ears stick out, it happens. Even if the guy's wearing a little helmet, which he almost certainly wasn't, it gets the ear. Well, Jesus said, "Am I leading a rebellion that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts. You did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. Notice what is not here. Peter doesn't want to talk about that it was him who cut off the ear. So he says one of those. And he doesn't go on to say that Jesus restored the ear to Malchus. We have to get that from the other Gospels. Because Peter didn't want to talk about that. Peter doesn't even want to talk about him leaving. He just said everyone fled. In other words, not just me, everyone fled. Everyone deserted him. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. The identity of the young man has been debated for some time. For a very, very long time, people were absolutely sure it was John. Now, almost all the theologians I'm reading say that it was Luke. So not an apostle, but one of those following. I'm not going to fight anybody on this. It was important at the time, but not important enough to name him. So I'm not going to worry about that. He was just wearing a linen garment. He was nobody special. Just a peasant young boy. But they tried to grab him. You see, it wasn't safe to be connected to Jesus back then. It may not be safe for you to be connected to Jesus. Now, you may live where I live, in a place where they call it the Bible Belt, but vast majority of people here don't go to worship. They're not part of an online church. They don't have any structured activity of Christianity, but they would say they believe, and they would even say they were Christian. But we also have a huge and growing minority who are not Christian, who may worship elsewhere, like a mosque or synagogue, but most of them not at all. They're nuns. They are N-O-N-E-S, worship nowhere. And for some of us to be a Christian at our work or at our school is a very, very dangerous thing to be. In other places in the world, it's dangerous as in prison or death. Jesus, even at that time, it wasn't safe to be attached to him. People are running now, hiding in the dark. The mob is coming. The religious leaders of the day are pulling this off. Technically, it wasn't the Jews that killed Jesus. It was the Romans. But even then, it wasn't the Jews that turned him over to the Romans. It was the religious leaders. It was the ones that called themselves closest to God who betrayed God. We need to remember that. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. So he's come back. So he's moving a little closer in. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. Now, I've had people say, how dare he warm himself at a fire when Jesus, what else is he going to do? Jesus has told him not to come out with a sword and fight. Peter's probably very confused, very afraid, and yet he has drawn close, but he's in enemy territory. If anybody figures out who he is and he's right there, he's in danger of being on a cross as well. The chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin, that was like their Supreme Court, not for Rome, but for the Jewish Commonwealth, that little Judea, that province, were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. Couldn't find any. See, that's the thing about living a perfect life. You can't find any reason to kill him, so you're going to have to pay witnesses to lie, and they'll do that. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then you see, why is that even brought up? You wouldn't even need that if all of these people had agreed ahead of time, we're going to kill him or hand him over to the Romans to kill him. This indicates on the Sanhedrin that among the chief priests there was disagreement, saying, wait a minute, we got to hear more about this. And then saying, wait, these don't line up. The accusers aren't saying the same things. So not everybody was bought into the let's kill him before this thing even started. We know that Saul of Tarsus was one of the Sanhedrin. Was he present that night? I don't know. Knowing what I know about Saul, later Paul the Apostle, I wonder if he was. Because this was at night, and the Sanhedrin, by law, the Deuteronomy law, you weren't allowed to meet at night. Nothing secret. And you know, there's so much about this which goes against Deuteronomy and Leviticus. They absolutely were breaking the law, and I imagine some of them were telling the others that as well, saying, this is not the way this should be. But that's not part of the record. And so let's just keep reading the record. Then some came up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with human hands. Yet even then, their testimony did not agree. So what's going on here? We'll go back to chapter 13. Each of the Gospels has this story about the apostles looking at the temple saying, isn't this really cool? This is massive. And Jesus saying, this is going to be torn down, not one stone upon another. But in 3 days, I'll resurrect the temple. So they were taking that, as we would say, out of context, and using it to say, Jesus was saying, I'm going to destroy the temple, and then I'll build it in 3 days, another one not made with hands. Miracle worker. Blasphemy to tear down the temple. Blasphemy to say that you could put it together without hands because you're equating yourself with God. Jesus was not a blasphemer, so their stories even then didn't line up. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. See, if God has decided this is the way things are going to move forward so that death can be destroyed, Jesus is going to take it. Not my will, but thine be done. Remember that? Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus. You just get chills. You better believe there were shouts, gasp, jaws hitting dirt, people swinging around going, what? When he did say this. This is in the middle of the most strictly, fiercely monotheistic people that have ever lived. And he's equating himself with God. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. We have another story in the others. We know that whenever one of the times, because this was not a one and done, that the high priest demanded Jesus to say, are you the Son of God? That Jesus says, that's what you've said. And a servant strikes Jesus, punches him right in the face. Say, how dare you answer the high priest so? What did Jesus mean when he said, that's what you've said? The high priest knew he was the Son of God. Now, if you've been following us, you know about the very strange parable of the wicked husbandman, the people that were renting out a field, and part of the agreement is whenever the harvest comes, we pay a portion of that to the owner. Owner sends a servant to collect his portion, they kill him. He sends another servant, they kill him. He sends his son, saying they dare not touch the son, because seriously, in Roman rule, you wouldn't do that. But the owners of the field looked at him and said, here's the son. If we kill him, we'll inherit the field, which is stupid on every level. There is no way in the world ever that would work. And it was stupid because that parable was about what the chief priest and they kept thinking, God will have to forgive us. He always forgives us. Maybe we'll go to Babylon again. Maybe we'll be drug off to Assyria, but then God will relent and he'll forgive us. We'll come back and our children. They did this because they thought they could lean on the grace of God to let them do this horrific thing, because eventually he has to. No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses? He asked. You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some of them began to spit at him. And they blindfolded him and struck him with their fist and said, prophesy. In other words, hey, tell us who hit you if you're so smart. Think about it. Jesus at any time could just explode all of them without saying a word. He could explode all of the universe. He could shut it down. He took it. Not a word. That is just stunning. And the guards took him and beat him. Wow. This is all going on right in sight of Peter. Peter was below in the courtyard. One of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You were also with that Nazarene, Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around him, this fellow is one of them. Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. Galileans, I'm told, that their accent was so thick they couldn't pass for anybody but a Galilean. And so they're going, guilt by association. If you're from Galilee, you must be with Jesus. His response, he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Right inside of Jesus. Right where Jesus can turn and look at him. Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Now, I hate breaking from the narrative, but we kind of have to here. If you look at each of the gospel accounts and you decide to read it in Western eyes, which is always a mistake, Western people require precision about numbers, events, the order of events. We will argue about it. You will get your doctorate degree writing massive dissertations nobody's ever going to read about what happened first in 1567 or in 1110 or in 1945. Orders of battle are argued about endlessly. They don't think that way. In very early manuscripts of Mark, where it says the rooster crows twice, here and earlier, the word twice isn't there. It's not written. It works in later. Why would it do that? Well, because in others, the cock crows but looks to be only once. And sometimes the order of when this all happens changes. And people will say, look at that. It can't be inspired because it has these contradictions in it. Jews weren't stupid. Still aren't. And people weren't stupid. They read these. They could see, if you ask them. It's kind of like Genesis 1, Genesis 2. The stories are different. Trying to mesh them does not work. Please have the integrity to admit these are different stories. And they understood these were different, but they did not require that amount of precision to get the point of the story. Remember that the point of the story is the point of the story, not the wee details we argue about. That, for example, Noah and the flood. If you start arguing about how much square footage a cheetah needs, you've really lost the plot. Your train of thought has left you standing at the station. Trains move forward because it's not about that. It's a story. Get the story. Get the point of the story. So I've had people argue about 2 times, 3 times, when and where. Don't do that. It's a story. And did it happen? Yes. Did it happen exactly this? That they're not interested in the exactly. They're interested in the point. And we can get the point if we get ourselves out of the way and just enter the story. He broke down and wept. Well, so would I. So would you. Nobody wants to be that person. Nobody wants to be the one that speaks against our Lord. Very early in the morning, the chief priest and the elders, the teachers of the law, the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So the whole Sanhedrin, it's possible that they did all gather by that time because it's now daylight. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Once again, it says whole Sanhedrin, majority rules here. There would have been dissent. I truly believe Paul, then Saul, would have dissented because of some of the illegalities already involved. But regardless, they bound Jesus, led him away, handed him over to Pilate. Now, Pilate is the governor of Judea. He's a Roman, not a Jew. His wife, we're going to find out, has been warned in a dream not to mess with Jesus because he is who he says he is. But Pilate didn't get that dream. He has no interest in this other than keeping the peace of Rome. And remember, we've talked about this before. The peace of Rome did not mean that everybody's rights were respected. In fact, you didn't have rights. They were quite happy to torture and kill an innocent person if that kept the peace. They didn't, in fact, they did that all the time. So he goes, "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You've said so," Jesus replied. In other words, you've already had this discussion, Pilate, and you think so. The chief priest accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of?" But still Jesus made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. If we read Isaiah 53, it'll talk about he didn't open his mouth. Now, that bothered me when I was a boy, because it said he never opened his mouth, and yet he did open his mouth sometimes here, and it dawned on me finally what it meant. It meant he never tried to defend himself. He made no defense. Doesn't mean he didn't say anything. He made no defense. Did not open his mouth against the accusations. Maybe that will help. It was a custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man named Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Let's explain. There had been many uprisings against the Romans and against the governors of the region and such. And you, again, if you've ever seen the movie Spartacus or the like, you know the Romans had no problem just nailing people to trees, just keeping the peace by killing as many as they needed to do. But this guy actually did commit murder in the uprising. So he was probably a zealot. Remember, a couple of Jesus' apostles were zealots as well. It's a political party, also known for being Sicarii, for being knife carriers and using those, illegally carrying them, and of course illegally using them against Roman authorities or collaborators. So sometimes the leader of the mob is popular, and Barabbas seems to have been. There was a time, boys and girls, where Hollywood liked to work off of these stories because these stories were well enough known among the populace that you could make movies about the stories and people went to see those. And so you would have, The Robe and Ben-Hur and Spartacus, and you would have stories about, movies about Barabbas as well, the before and the after. And yeah, they didn't stick strictly to the book, but Hollywood never does. But it was interesting that these stories were well enough known that they were put in positive lights. That, there really is a God, there really is morality. The robe, the guy that helped crucify Jesus, comes to Jesus, and that's a good thing. Those days are long, long gone. But those movies are still out there, and they're kind of fun to watch. Some of them are a little cheesy, but some of them are fun to watch. So moving on, he says, "Do you want me," Pilate talking to the crowd, saying, "All right, you want me to release somebody? Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" Knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priest had handed Jesus over to him. Notice, the Jews hadn't handed him over. The chief priest. It is the religiously smug, arrogant leaders of churches that did this, not the common folk. We're told, in fact, the common folk heard Jesus gladly. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd. Priest is plural there. Stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. Pilate kind of rocked back on his heels here. He says, "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him," wanting to satisfy the crowd. Nothing about justice here at all. It never enters the equation in Rome. Justice is not a part of trials at all in Rome. Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. We're going to stop here. We're going to pick it up again tomorrow. And you're going to be watching this. If you watch it the day they come out, you're going to be watching it between Palm Sunday and Easter. What timing, huh? I hope that you're with us on Palm Sunday and Easter. Please also share this. People need to hear these stories. So share the website with one person this week, another person next week, and help us get the story of Jesus out there without all the barnacles on the ship of faith that, of church buildings and denominations and doctrinal statements, just getting the stories of Jesus out there. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for donating to us. Thank you for helping us keep these stories alive and out where people can hear them. God bless you. Have a blessed Holy Week, and we will see you right in the middle of that.